Hello, everyone. Professor Philip Travis, and this week we are going to be looking at the British North American colonies. We're particularly going to be looking at the development in the Chesapeake area as well as in the New England colonies. The Chesapeake refers to the areas around Virginia, Maryland, parts of North Carolina too, the areas generally surrounding the Chesapeake Bay. Areas making up places like Virginia today. And of course, depicted here is an event known as Bacon's Rebellion, and this is meant to depict the destruction of the village of Jamestown during Bacon's Rebellion. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. So this week we're looking at in our reading, we're looking at the British and New England colonies, particularly during the 1600s and the early 1700s. We have a quiz this week, and the quiz is based on the aspects of your reading related to the Chesapeake colony and a primary source that you'll find in our content modules area on Bacon's Rebellion. So let's talk a little bit about this, and this will be your factoid for this week. Remember, for your bonus points, to earn bonus points towards a test score at the end of term, just by the end of the day on Wednesday, post a summary of the factoid that I'm getting ready to state to you in that little extra credit discussion area there, and you get a bonus point. Sometimes they give you more than one bonus points for it. And then at the end of the term, the bonus points are all added up. They're added to a test score, and they can pull your grade up by 2-3 grade points. So they're not insignificant at the end of the term. It could be the difference between a B and an A, or a C and a B, or even obviously a D or a C. But hopefully everyone's in the B-A range at the end of the term. In the late 1600s, particularly 1675 and 1676, both in New England and also in the Chesapeake, there are major uprisings and wars. And the wars are particularly directed at Native Americans. In New England, there was increasing violence between Native Americans and the colonists, and this led to a conflict in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and surrounding New England colonies. It expanded into Rhode Island as well, as a war known as King Philip's War. And it was turned into be a particularly brutal war. Towns were besieged, and likewise Native American villages were destroyed as the colonists ultimately adopted an effectively like a scorched earth policy against native settlements, or at least enemy native settlements. There were some Native Americans in the greater New England area that were friendly allies, I suppose you would say, with the New Englanders. However, King Philip's War was an example of the Massachusetts Bay Colony increasingly expanding and pushing back Native American peoples in the New England colonies. We see a similar circumstance in the Chesapeake, and that's what this drawing is depicting. So, the Chesapeake, of course, John Rolfe, it becomes associated with commodifying tobacco. And this is very early on in the period of the Chesapeake colony. Tobacco was first sort of identified following the voyages of Columbus, and then it was again identified in areas of the Chesapeake. Native Americans were smoking tobacco. The tobacco like sort of variant in areas like Cuba was deemed to be of greater quality, and John Rolfe would take seeds and basically hybridize the tobacco plant in the Chesapeake to make it a more commodified product. So the Chesapeake turned into a sort of tobacco colony, where tobacco, and of course, King James of England at the time was not super keen on smoking tobacco, but nonetheless, it was really the only thing at this time that the Virginia colony had that could make itself profitable for England and its parent company, the Virginia Company, at least initially. And so tobacco becomes the commodity, the cash crop of the Chesapeake. And during the 1600s, the primary motive of labor in much of the 1600s was something called indentured servitude. Now, slavery existed in the Chesapeake colonies, but it sort of grew gradually. By the middle of the 1600s, there was something like 300 slaves in the Chesapeake, in Virginia, I should say. And by the early 1700s, there was something in the way of like 16,000 slaves. And so slavery existed, but it gradually developed over a period of roughly a century in the Chesapeake colony. And part of the reason for that is actually related to this drawing of Bacon's Rebellion. Most of the labor in the sort of the middle of the 1600s in the Chesapeake was called indentured servitude. And what that meant, there was not a lot of job opportunities in Great Britain. And so the lack of job opportunities, overpopulation, and so forth in Great Britain encouraged people to migrate. And they came to the Chesapeake looking really for land and the opportunity to farm that land and gain profit from it, particularly through the farming of tobacco. Well, many of the individuals that came couldn't afford to pay for the passage across the Atlantic. And so they would get a sponsor to pay for them. And they would, as part of their contract, this was called their indenture, the way that they paid for their travel is they would accept a contract to work as a laborer for a large plantation in the Chesapeake. And the duration of the contracts were typically 6 years, and you would work your indenture, and then you would gain freedom. And the idea was, upon gaining freedom, there would be accessible land and the ability of these individuals to profit. Well, by the time you got to the 1670s, Virginia, which was at the time led by Governor Berkeley, and also the House of Burgesses, an early sort of representative colonial governance system. The Chesapeake colony was very small. It hugged the rivers and it hugged the bay. And the West, the areas towards, say, for example, the Appalachian Mountains were extremely western in this period of time. And these lands were all controlled and dominated by Native Americans. Well, you have these large populations now of free landless individuals, and led by an individual named Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon demanded that the colony authorize them to be allowed to basically attack and seize Native Americans and their land so they could clear it and farm it. Governor Berkeley did not want to do this because there was sort of a stability in the Chesapeake. The sort of big plantation owners were making lots of money, and they wanted to avoid further conflict with Native Americans. To make this narrative, and you're going to read about this week, Nathaniel Bacon led an uprising, and they attacked Native Americans seeking to seize their land, and then they ultimately also attacked Jamestown. And as you see depicted here, Jamestown is burned. And Nathaniel Bacon is then pursued, him and his followers, but Bacon will die, his followers will be executed, the rebellion fails. But the result of the rebellion was an increasing move in the Chesapeake towards a use of slavery. Indentured servitude was seen as something that, because it wasn't permanent, it was something that posed the potential threat of uprisings and revolts such as this in the future. And as a result of this, after the 1676 failed uprising of Bacon's Rebellion, one witnesses the Chesapeake shift increasingly towards the use of slaves in labor. And by the time you get to the middle of the 1700s, the Chesapeake has really become a slave society, meaning a society in which slaves made up the core basis of the labor and the economy. Summarize that in the Extra Credit Discussion Forum. Maybe I'll give you 2 bonus points this week. This was a little long after all, so get your bonus points added to a test score. I'll see you in the discussion forum this week. Don't forget, quiz this week.